Tonight we wander into a place that glows softly, almost unreal, as if the very air has been painted with crushed lapis lazuli. You find yourself in a Persian garden at dusk. Orange blossoms tilt their fragrant heads, fountains murmur with moonlit ripples, and peacocks somewhere out of sight give the occasional theatrical cry. It feels like stepping into the first page of an illuminated manuscript, except you're here in person, barefoot on marble tiles that have absorbed the day's warmth. It's beautiful, intoxicating, and also, let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes if you actually time-traveled back here. Between questionable water, ambitious insects, and the odd Mongol raid, you'd be begging for your modern air conditioning and bottled tea. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Persian miniature doesn't arrive fully formed, it grows like the jasmine vines that cling to these garden walls. You sit under a pomegranate tree, and it's here that courtly poets once gathered to recite verses. They spoke of love, longing, and wisdom wrapped in metaphor so dense that it still sends literature students into a spiral today. It's no coincidence that painting and poetry blossomed together. Both crafts trained the eye to notice the tiniest detail. A single rose petal might inspire an entire ghazal, just as a painter could fill an inch-wide corner of parchment with swirling leaves more intricate than your phone wallpaper. The gardens of Persia weren't just landscaping flexes, they were cosmic diagrams. 4 quadrants, 4 rivers, 4 directions, a little microcosm of paradise itself. As you stroll the shaded paths, you realize that painters borrowed this same symmetry. Their art wasn't aiming for realism, you won't find proper perspective lines like in a Renaissance fresco, but for a serene order where every bird, leaf, and cloud has its calm place. And yes, historians still argue whether these gardens influenced the paintings or the paintings influenced how gardens were imagined. Like a chicken and egg problem, but with way more roses and fountains. One mainstream fact grounds you. By the 13th century, under dynasties like the Ilkhanids, manuscript illustration began to flourish in Persia. Think Shahnameth, the Book of Kings, sprawling across hundreds of folios with dazzling images of heroes, monsters, and philosophers, all framed by decorative flora. These weren't just pretty embellishments, they were power moves. To commission such a manuscript was to flex intellectual might, cultural dominance, and yes, wallet size. But here's the quirky bit you didn't expect. Some surviving manuscripts have faint tea, or rather, coffee stains, fingerprints, and even doodles by later owners. Imagine some medieval scribe painstakingly gilding a dragon's wing, only for a bored grandson centuries later to draw a stick figure in the margin. Human nature stays undefeated. And as you lounge on the stone bench by the water channel, you can almost hear those painters whispering across time. Each brushstroke whispers, "Slow down. Observe." The smallest details, like the curl of a cypress tree or the tilt of a nightingale's head, can hold whole worlds. The garden is more than decoration, it is the breathing ground of patience, the seedbed of the miniature's calming art. You tilt your head back, see stars twinkling in a desert sky so wide it makes your modern anxieties look laughably small. The garden hums softly, just as the miniature pages hum centuries later when you gaze into them. A fountain's trickle becomes the rhythm of your breath. Somewhere, faintly, a poet chuckles, maybe at a verse too clever by half, maybe at you stumbling over the pronunciation of Shahnameth. Either way, the laughter joins the murmur of water and the rustle of leaves, guiding you deeper into this painted dream. You lean closer, squinting at a surface that seems alive with specks of color. At first you think you're looking at a butterfly's wing, but no, this is paint, laid down so delicately you'd swear it was woven rather than brushed. Persian miniaturists didn't wield fat brushes or splashy oils, their tools were almost comically small. Brushes sometimes made from a single cat hair, or at least so fine they could rival an eyelash. Imagine trying to ink the curve of a peacock feather with a tool thinner than dental floss. If your hand shook even once, goodbye dignity. You watch an apprentice grinding pigments under the master's eye. He's not squeezing paint from a tube, those won't be invented for centuries, but crushing semi-precious stones, metals, and plants into powder. Lapis lazuli travels all the way from Afghan mountains, turned into the bluest blue humanity has ever known. Gold leaf is beaten until it trembles in the air like a sunbeam caught in paper form. Malachite makes greens so deep you feel like you're staring into the ocean. Even walnut shells get a second career as earthy browns. It's not just art supplies, it's geology, chemistry, and commerce all tangled up. Historians still argue whether these pigments were prized more for their symbolic meanings or for sheer visual dazzle. Was lapis about the heavens, or just a way to make readers go oh like medieval magpies? The debate doesn't end, but you lean toward both. Humans love meaning, but also shiny things. Here's a solid fact: miniature painters worked on burnished paper, sometimes coated with starch and polished smooth with agate stones. You run your fingers across one folio and feel that strange slickness, like parchment crossed with glass. Onto this surface, each layer of pigment was patiently added in washes so thin that even your modern Instagram filters feel clumsy in comparison. But patience wasn't optional, it was the job. Hours, then days, then months for a single page. Some workshops had assistants whose only task was dotting stars onto skies or drawing tiny blades of grass until their eyesight gave out. The master would stroll past, stroke his beard, and say, "No, no, that leaf looks tired, redo it." If you think your boss micromanages, try explaining to a Persian master why you smudged a horse's hoof. And then there are the quirky anecdotes. One manuscript shows a rider galloping with his horse's legs all stretched out like a child's doodle. Art historians scratch their heads, but a fringe theory says maybe the painter was experimenting with early motion illustration, Persian Miniature, if you will. Or maybe he was just having an off day. We'll never know, but it's comforting to think even geniuses had sloppy Tuesdays. The more you stare, the more hypnotic the detail becomes. A tulip petal thinner than a fingernail, a curl of script so small you'd need magnifying glass to see it. You can almost feel your breath slow, your heartbeat settle into rhythm with the brush. This is art as meditation, not spectacle. In a world of giant murals and monumental architecture, Persian miniature painting whispers instead of shouts. You're reminded of a joke painters probably never made aloud. What's the difference between us and the builders of Persepolis? Their columns collapse. Our flowers never wilt. It's a comforting thought, even if whispered sarcastically. As night thickens in your imagined workshop, you notice the apprentice's hand trembles slightly, not from fatigue but awe. To paint at this scale isn't about ego, it's about surrender. Every brushstroke declares, detail matters, patience matters, the world is found in inches, not miles. And if you've ever zoomed into Google Maps too far and ended up staring at one pixel of grass, you already know the feeling. The miniature asks you to live in that pixel and call it paradise. The workshop grows busier now. You shuffle to the edge of a low cushion and watch the day unfold around you. The master painter murmurs instructions, the apprentices grind their colors, and somewhere outside the sound of a camel bell drifts in like punctuation. But here, inside these walls, every brushstroke is a courtly affair, because Persian miniatures didn't exist in a vacuum, they belonged to kings, scholars, and, occasionally, the copper-stained chaos of real life. A mainstream fact first: under the Timurid and later Safavid dynasties, royal courts became patrons of the miniature arts. Imagine libraries stuffed with manuscripts so ornate they doubled as luxury status symbols. Shahs commissioned illustrated histories, epic poems, even treatises on astronomy, each page twinkling with painted gold. When a ruler opened a manuscript, It wasn't just reading material, it was a mirror reflecting his glory back at him, wrapped in jewel tones. Think of it as a medieval flex, like pulling out a solid gold iPhone at the dinner table. Now tilt your head closer. In between those gilded frames, sometimes you catch little imperfections, quirks that tell you these were living books, not museum specimens. One manuscript has faint circles in the margins, stains left from a cup carelessly set down by someone more interested in caffeine than calligraphy. That's right, centuries before hipster cafes, some scholar was sipping bitter brew over priceless art. You cringe, but also smile, because it's proof these works weren't frozen relics. They were companions. Historians still argue whether some margin doodles were added by later owners or sneaky apprentices with idle hands. In one folio, a tiny stick figure lurks near a palace gate, as if a bored teenager from the 16th century couldn't resist leaving a medieval Kilraw was here. Scholarly debate rages, but let's be honest, you'd probably doodle too after your 100th page of painting identical cypress trees. And then there's the social swirl around these manuscripts. Picture a scribe hunched over velvety paper, copying verses in precise Nastaliq script, while beside him a painter adds jewel-toned carpets and silk robes. Court poets may wander in, reciting lines of Hulfez, while officials gossip about tax reforms or which emir borrowed which horse. It's not a silent studio, it's part salon, part factory, part coffee break. Someone sneezes, someone chuckles, and someone, inevitably, spills ink. Quirky tidbit. Some manuscripts were never intended to be read line by line. Instead, they were shown off like art albums, leafed through casually while courtiers pointed at their favorite scenes. It's basically the medieval version of passing around vacation photos, except the vacation involved mythical beasts, flying horses, and a generous splash of gold leaf. You notice how different people in the room engage with the art. The king pretends to study it thoughtfully but is really waiting for compliments. The poet leans in to admire the harmony between verse and color. The apprentice simply sighs, dreaming of the day his own brushstrokes will live in the royal library. Meanwhile, you, the intruder from the future, realize this was art meant to be shared, discussed, even gossiped about, not locked away in glass cases. And yet, the quieter truth sneaks in with the scent of ink. Behind the pomp, there's always the human. Someone stayed up too late outlining horses. Someone coughed while grinding azurite. Someone fell asleep on a folio and left a smudge that outlived empires. Perfection was the goal, but imperfection tells the better story. You chuckle softly, because centuries later, people will still complain about coffee stains on borrowed books. Some things never change. And in that realization, you feel oddly close to the long-gone scribes, as though across time you're sharing the same weary sigh, the same laugh at life's little messes. You step out of the workshop and into the dry night air, following the path of caravans rumbling in from distant lands. Bells jingle, hooves scuff dust into the moonlight, and the creak of wooden wheels joins the chorus of merchants haggling. If the Persian miniature is a jewel box, then the Silk Road is the treasure chest that supplied it. Every pigment, every idea, every fragment of story owes something to these endless caravans. Fact first, lapis lazuli from Badakhshan in Afghanistan was among the most coveted imports. This stone, when ground, produced the ultramarine that makes skies in Persian miniatures glow like eternity itself. Venetian painters later hoarded the same pigment for their Madonnas, but Persian artists had already mastered the glow centuries before. Alongside lapis came cinnabar for reds, verdigris for greens, and gold beaten so thin it could float if you sneezed too hard near it. And trade didn't just deliver materials, it brought stories. Caravans carried Buddhist scrolls, Chinese silk, Indian epics, and even fragments of Greek philosophy, all of which seeped into Persian imagination. That's why you sometimes see a dragon with suspiciously Chinese whiskers lurking in a Persian folio. Historians still argue whether this cross-pollination was deliberate borrowing or just the inevitable result of ideas drifting like desert sand. Either way, the miniature became a cultural passport, stamped with influences from far beyond Persia's borders. Quirky tidbit. Some pigments were so expensive they had to be rationed like medieval caviar. Apprentices joked about watering down ultramarine with cheaper blues when the master wasn't looking. And there's at least one manuscript where scholars swear the artist reused pigment scraped off an older, less important page, basically the original recycling project. Makes your thrift store shopping look tame. As you walk alongside the caravan, you hear merchants boasting about their goods. One unrolls silk dyed with saffron so bright it stings your eyes, another shows off turquoise stones said to protect travelers from accidents, though the camel driver with a limp isn't convinced. And in a corner of the marketplace, a painter inspects packets of crushed cochineal, fingering the powder with reverence, already imagining the velvet reds it will unleash on paper. The caravanserai at night hums with languages Arabic, Persian, Turkic, Chinese. You catch words you don't fully understand, yet the laughter and bargaining are universal. A bowl of lentil stew passes your way, spiced and steaming, and for a moment you forget whether you're a traveler or just a dreamer. This is how culture moves, on tired legs, through long nights, carried in sacks and songs. You glance at a painted page again, and suddenly its brilliance feels heavier. That gold sky. Someone dug metal out of mountains for it. That emerald robe. Maybe it traveled 3,000 miles before ending up under the brush. Behind every delicate leaf is the echo of footsteps on the Silk Road. The miniature, for all its stillness, is stitched with movement. And so you follow the road a little longer, lanterns bobbing ahead like stars on sticks. A camel sneezes. Someone tells a dirty joke about a merchant and a donkey, and laughter ripples through the night. Even here, surrounded by commerce and exhaustion, beauty sneaks in rolled up in bolts of silk, waiting to unfurl centuries later on a painted page. You duck back through the carved wooden doors of a workshop, the air suddenly thick with the smell of glue, pigment, and candle wax. This is no lonely artist's garret. It's a humming hive where silence is punctured by coughs, mutters, and the occasional sharp rebuke. The Persian miniature is not born in isolation but in the discipline of the atelier, where masters and apprentices circle each other like planets in a patient orbit. A mainstream fact anchors you. Ateliers thrived especially under the Timurid dynasty in the 15th century and later under the Safavids. Royal courts maintained entire studios, often called kitabkhaner, where painters, calligraphers, gilders, and binders collaborated on manuscripts. These weren't hobby groups but full-on creative factories, funded by kings who wanted to display both power and taste. Each folio was a team effort, stitched together like a quilt of talents. You overhear a master correcting a student's line, too stiff. Flow like water. His voice is gentle, but the lesson is sharp. Hours are spent repeating the curve of a single cloud or the arch of a horse's neck until muscle memory takes over. The master believes perfection isn't achieved by inspiration but by stubborn repetition. Yet not everything is rigid. Here comes the quirky tidbit. Some surviving notes in the margins of workshop manuscripts show debates, tiny scribbled disagreements between master and apprentice about details. Imagine one complaining, "This lion looks more like a house cat." It's proof that these studios weren't silent monasteries but places of conversation, even light-hearted bickering. Historians still argue whether apprentices were allowed creative freedom or simply executed the master's strict designs. Was an assistant who added a slightly tilted flower reprimanded, or praised for flair? The truth, like most workshop gossip, is lost. But the tension between precision and personality vibrates in every miniature. As you linger, the murmur of the atelier feels almost musical. One artist outlines in brown ink so fine it could be mistaken for a spider's thread. Another lays flat washes of color, humming under his breath. A third waits until the surface dries before adding stipples of gold, his hand steady as though the universe depends on it. The rhythm of work lulls you into a trance, like listening to rain tap against a roof. Then comes the unexpected. A splash of pigment drops where it shouldn't. A gasp ripples through the room. For a moment, disaster hangs in the air, but the master leans forward, squints, and says, "It looks like a rock now. Leave it." Accident becomes feature. You smile, because this is ART's eternal secret. Even perfectionists sometimes have to wing it. You imagine what it feels like to apprentice here. Your eyes ache from staring at the page, your back stiff from hours bent over. But when the candlelight catches the shimmer of gold you've just laid down, the exhaustion feels worth it. In that sparkle, you glimpse eternity. And you realize that this practice is more than work, it's training in calmness itself. The workshop isn't just producing manuscripts, it's producing patience, humility, and a kind of meditative devotion. Every mistake teaches acceptance. Every correction teaches resilience. In a sense, the miniature atelier was an early wellness retreat, minus the yoga mats and overpriced smoothies. By the time the day ends, the folio on the desk has transformed. Yesterday it was just faint outlines. Today it sings with color, detail, and life. You trace the edges with your gaze and feel the workshop's murmurs echo inside you. Order, chaos, discipline, and accident all coexist on this fragile square of paper. The folio before you opens like a stage curtain, and suddenly the room is gone. You're staring into a world of shimmering beasts and improbable skies, where heroes ride flying horses that look suspiciously like unicorns caught mid-espresso. Persian miniatures loved their mythologies, especially the grand tales of the Shahnameth, the Book of Kings, which sprawled across hundreds of illustrated folios. One mainstream fact: the Shahnameth, composed by Ferdowsi around the year 1000, became Persia's national epic and a favorite canvas for miniature artists. Kings hired ateliers to illustrate battles, romances, and philosophical parables with dazzling visuals. By the 16th century, entire workshops in Herat, Tabriz, and Shiraz dedicated themselves to this project, turning myth into something you could literally flip through on your lap. Dragons curl like smoke, their scales glittering with stippled gold. Heroes like Rostam wrestle demons with casual bravado, wearing robes so patterned they'd make a Gucci designer weep. And in the corner, tiny courtiers sip wine as if the fate of the cosmos doesn't depend on the duel happening 2 inches away. The balance between epic seriousness and cozy detail makes you chuckle. It's like if Marvel movies kept cutting away to someone fixing their teapot mid-battle. Quirky tidbit: one illustrated folio shows Simma, the mythical bird, with feathers painted in so many layers of color that restorers centuries later discovered the painter had worked with almost obsessive secrecy. He used ultramarine, vermilion, and even powdered silver underlayers just to make a single wing glimmer. Talk about being extra. Historians still argue whether these fantastical beasts were purely symbolic or whether they preserved scraps of cultural memory, echoes of older myths from India, Mesopotamia, or even dinosaur bones unearthed by chance. Were dragons just metaphor, or did some herder stumble on a fossil and think, "Yep, monster confirmed"? No consensus, but the debate adds another shimmer to the page. As you turn another folio, a flying horse streaks across the page, hooves tucked neatly beneath a rider in brilliant scarlet. The perspective is flat, yes, but the energy radiates like a modern comic panel. You realize how these paintings compress time. A battle that might rage for days is condensed into a single square where every spear, shield, and plume is frozen mid-motion. It's like binge-watching a whole season of epic drama in one glance. And the humor sneaks in, too. One demon grimaces like he's just stubbed his toe rather than facing annihilation. Another scene shows warriors clashing while, in the margin, Two musicians play calmly as though battle makes the best background beat. It's not all solemn grandeur, these artists winked at life's absurdities even while painting kings and monsters. The more you look, the calmer you feel. Strange, isn't it? The page bursts with battles and fire-breathing beasts, yet the precision of the brushwork, the controlled colors, the balance of composition all create tranquility. Violence becomes ornamental, chaos becomes patterned, the storm is captured and tamed. You close the folio gently, as if putting to bed the dragons themselves. They don't roar anymore, they just shimmer in silence, their fury distilled into beauty. And you wonder if that's the true secret of the miniature, turning the overwhelming into something you can hold, like a lullaby painted in gold and lapis. Your eyes adjust now to a folio that feels less like a myth and more like a dollhouse, except one gilded for royalty. Persian miniatures adored architecture, not just the grand exterior of palaces and mosques, but their insides too, as if walls were made of glass. You lean in and see rooms folded open like origami, staircases climbing nowhere, and roofs politely removed so you can peek at the lives within. Fact first, this visual style is often described as simultaneous perspective, where buildings appear flattened and interiors exposed. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Persian artists were consistently using this method to depict palace scenes, banquets, and bustling bazaars. Forget Renaissance vanishing points, this was about narrative clarity, not optical trickery. You're invited to see everything at once, like reading multiple text threads without missing a message. As you study a painted palace, you notice figures lounging on carpets, their robes blooming with pattern. One chamber holds musicians plucking lutes, another a scribe lost in poetry, and out in the courtyard servants pour wine under the shade of cypress trees. The whole building becomes less an architectural blueprint than a mood board of aristocratic life. Quirky tidbit: some miniatures include staircases that lead nowhere or windows that open onto blank walls. Historians shrug and laugh, debating whether this was symbolic dream logic or just an artist deciding perspective was overrated. One scholar half-seriously suggested these impossible stairs inspired later European fantasy art, though others argue it was just the painter saying, "Meh, close enough." And yet, historians still argue whether these cutaway interiors were meant as literal depictions of Persian palaces or as idealized fantasies. No blueprint survives to confirm whether the Safavid court really had those rainbow-tiled ceilings or candy-striped columns. Maybe these were architectural wish lists, more Pinterest board than photo album. What calms you is how the geometry of it all creates order. Every room is framed in crisp color blocks, every arch repeats like a mantra. The chaos of human life, gossip, flirtation, spilled wine is contained neatly within patterned walls. Even the courtiers look a little too polite, their hands arranged like actors rehearsing a scene. Yet humor lurks in the details. Look closer and you'll see a servant sneaking a grape, or a cat curled in the corner ignoring the royal drama. One painting even hides a figure peeking from behind a curtain, face half curious, half bored. It feels less like staged propaganda and more like an artist smuggling in humanity behind the gold. You imagine yourself wandering those painted corridors. The air smells faintly of rosewater, carpets cushion every step, and somewhere a flute drifts lazily through an open arch. No roof above you, because roofs don't matter when you're the reader, the voyeur, the dreamer allowed to trespass. It's an architecture not of stone but of imagination. And just like that, you understand the trick. Persian miniatures weren't documenting reality, they were giving you access, letting you walk through palaces you'd never enter, sit at banquets you'd never be invited to. They flattened space so you could occupy it without barriers. You close the folio with a sigh. The palace vanishes, but the calm geometry lingers, like the afterimage of stained glass when you close your eyes. Your fingers trace the edges of another folio, and the air shifts. Gone are the roaring dragons and impossible palaces, now the page glows with a softer intimacy. You find yourself eavesdropping on lovers hidden in painted margins, their faces tilted toward each other with shy gravity, their robes spilling into one another like mingled rivers. Persian miniatures could roar with battles, yes, but they could also whisper with tenderness. A grounding fact: by the 16th century, especially under the Safavid dynasty, miniature painters produced countless illustrations of romances, sometimes drawn from classics like Layla and Majnun, other times from lyrical poetry collections. These scenes often showed clandestine meetings in gardens, moonlit glances exchanged behind patterned screens, or even pairs of lovers seated together on carpets as though the rest of the world didn't exist. Quirky tidbit: in some manuscripts, you'll notice that servants or attendants in the background seem more invested in the romance than the lovers themselves. One page shows Layla and Majnun gazing at each other with stoic calm while a nosy maid leans in, practically winking at the viewer like, "You're seeing this?" It's a reminder that gossip has always been a global pastime. Historians still argue whether these love scenes were coded reflections of real courtly affairs or simply allegories of the soul's longing for the divine. Was a boy sneaking across a garden wall painted as scandal, or as mystical metaphor? Maybe both, depending on how nervously the commissioner of the manuscript shifted in his seat while flipping pages. You lean closer. The lovers' faces are painted with astonishing delicacy, almond eyes outlined in faint brown, lips tinted coral, expressions somewhere between sorrow and bliss. Their bodies rarely touch fully. Instead, a single hand extended or a shared cushion becomes the center of gravity. It's the kind of restraint that modern cinema could learn from: less special effects, more fingertip tension. The setting is just as telling. Lovers rarely meet in bland spaces. They're framed by night-blooming jasmine, marble fountains, or moon-drenched gardens. Nature conspires to shelter them, like a stage hand dimming the lights and cueing the music. Even when things are tragic, and in Persian love stories, they often are, the miniatures soften the heartbreak with delicate detail. A dying lover might lie in a meadow where every flower seems to nod in sympathy. And yet, sometimes humor peeks through. You can't help but chuckle at one folio where a lover is clearly trying to climb a wall, his robe snagged awkwardly on a thorn bush. Was the painter being cheeky, or reminding us that romance is as clumsy as it is exalted? Probably both. As you watch, the calm of these pages seeps into you. The lovers don't rush, they gaze, they wait, they exist in suspended time. There's no frantic chase scene, no dramatic violin crescendo, just the soft brush of color, the balance of detail, the patience of longing. And you realize, the miniature, even in romance, teaches the same lesson as in epic battles or grand palaces. Life's dramas, whether cosmic or personal, are best savored slowly, with eyes open to the smallest details. The page turns, and suddenly you're tumbling into geometry. Not dragons, not palaces, not lovers, but stars, endlessly repeating stars. Circles inside hexagons, hexagons blooming into lattices, patterns so precise they make your brain hum like a tuning fork. Persian miniature painting didn't only frame epics and romances, it also leaned into the hypnotic world of Islamic geometry, where mathematics and art danced together until you could hardly tell them apart. A grounding fact: geometric ornament in Persian manuscripts drew from centuries of Islamic design principles. From the 10th century onward, artists worked with grids and compasses to create tessellations of stars, polygons, and interlacing bands. By the 15th century, these motifs weren't just architectural: mosques, madrasas, and domes, but spilled onto manuscript margins, page borders, and even entire miniature backgrounds. Historians still argue whether these geometric forms were intended as spiritual roadmaps or simply as dazzling decoration. Did the endless stars symbolize infinity and divine unity, or were they just there to impress courtiers who liked shiny things? The safe answer is both. But the debate keeps scholars awake at night with their compasses and rulers. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some surviving folios show faint pencil marks, construction lines, beneath the painted patterns. The artist sketched with a compass, scratched tiny dots into the paper, and then layered paint over the scaffolding. So yes, even in the 15th century, great art sometimes began as math homework. You sit cross-legged in front of one glowing page. Blue stars ripple outward, each petal touching the next, forming a pattern that feels alive. The longer you look, the more the shapes pulse, until you're not sure whether the page is flat or vibrating. This isn't just art to glance at, it's art to meditate with. Your mind drifts, and you imagine the painter himself hunched over, compass in hand, whispering prayers with each circle drawn. The act of repeating becomes a kind of trance, a form of devotion not unlike chanting. Every mistake corrected, every line refined, until the page itself breathes rhythm. And there's humor, too. Imagine an apprentice tasked with painting 1,000 tiny stars in the background while the master strolls by and says, "Only 999 more to go." Somewhere in the margins of history, you can almost hear the eye rolls. But sitting here, you understand the calmness this art offers. Unlike a narrative painting full of motion and drama, geometry asks nothing of you except stillness. No heroes to cheer, no villains to boo, just infinite patterns whispering. Breathe, repeat, dissolve. You tilt your head back, close your eyes, and for a moment the patterns remain, etched behind your eyelids like constellations. You're not lost, you're exactly where you should be, drifting inside the mathematics of beauty. The sound changes now, not stars and polygons, but a softer rhythm, the brushstroke of letters flowing across a page. Persian miniature painting was rarely lonely. It almost always lived beside calligraphy, as though image and word were siblings bound together from birth. You lean over the manuscript and see the poetry winding like a river, each letter elongated, curling, stretching, whispering silently to you. Here's your grounding fact. In Persian culture, calligraphy was considered the highest art, even more exalted than painting. Masters of script, Nastalk in particular, were revered, their letters praised for elegance, proportion, and musicality. The script itself was designed to look like flowing clouds. Not a bad compliment for your handwriting, if only your grocery lists looked this ethereal. And yet, miniature painters and calligraphers worked side by side, sometimes literally on the same bench. A scribe would fill a page with verse, then leave carefully measured spaces for the painter to insert vignettes. There was choreography here, an invisible dance. The letters guided the eye across the page, while the pictures punctuated the rhythm. Without one, the other seemed incomplete. Historians still argue whether painters were subordinate to calligraphers, or whether they collaborated as equals. Some manuscripts clearly give script priority, with tiny images squeezed into corners like polite afterthoughts. Others let painting dominate, the letters almost serving as captions. The debate continues, like an endless call and response between scholars who love words and those who love pictures. Here's your quirky tidbit. In a few surviving folios, you can find where a calligrapher sneezed or spilled ink mid-stroke. The blot remains, centuries later, immortalized by accident. Imagine being remembered by future generations not for your artistry but for your clumsy lunch break. A humbling thought. As you study the letters, you realize they aren't just written, they're painted. Each line is laid with care, the thickness controlled, the curves polished. You almost hear the pen, a reed cut to a precise angle, scratching softly against the page. It's like listening to a musician practice scales, repetition, fluidity, discipline. You smile, because it's strangely relatable. Just as you sometimes doodle in the margins of a notebook during a boring meeting, so too did scribes embellish their work with tiny flourishes, loops, or even hidden signatures disguised in the curves of words. Calligraphy wasn't just function, it was personality. sneaking through in a flick of the wrist. Your eyes blur slightly, lulled by the repetition. Word after word, curling and stretching, until language itself seems secondary. You no longer need to know what the verse says, you feel its rhythm. The silent poetry is enough. There's something deeply calming in the marriage of image and script. Miniatures provide color and story, calligraphy gives heartbeat and breath. Together, they create a universe that hums softly under your fingertips. You lean closer, almost hearing it sing a silent song written in ink and silence. Your eyes drift now to the very surface beneath all this artistry, the paper itself. It looks so ordinary from afar, just a pale background, yet up close it feels like its own little cosmos. You touch the edge of a folio with your fingertip, half afraid it will crumble, and half amazed that it hasn't already. Here's your grounding fact. Persian papermaking spread from China via the Islamic world, arriving in Iran around the 8th century. By the time miniature painting flourished, papermakers in cities like Samarkand and Shiraz had perfected sheets that were polished smooth with agate stones. These weren't the rough, pulpy notebook pages you crumple in frustration. They gleamed faintly, ready to hold pigment and gold leaf. Historians still argue whether the greatest surviving miniatures owe their brilliance more to the painters or to the quality of the paper. After all, pigments cling differently to different textures, and an uneven surface could ruin a carefully painted dragon or lover's face. So, was the unsung hero of miniature painting really the papermaker? The debate remains unresolved, with scholars occasionally sounding like stage parents defending their favorite child. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some manuscripts have been found where the paper itself was dyed pink, blue, or even gold before the painter ever touched it. Imagine flipping through your math textbook only to find the entire thing printed on lavender pages. Learning algebra might suddenly feel like flipping through a wedding album. Of course, not everything about paper is romantic. Moths adore it. Moisture warps it. Careless handling leaves fingerprints that linger centuries longer than the handlers themselves. You picture a 16th century courtier snacking on pomegranates while leafing through a freshly illuminated folio, unknowingly smearing juice across a margin. Conservation nightmares, centuries in the making. Yet, despite fragility, this paper carried entire universes. Poets, painters, and scribes conspired to compress gardens, palaces, and battles into folios small enough to hide inside a sleeve. Each sheet was less a page and more a doorway, one you could fold closed, tuck away, and summon later when you needed a little beauty. You chuckle at the idea that, in some sense, these manuscripts were the medieval equivalent of a smartphone, compact, portable, and addictive. Except instead of doom-scrolling, you found yourself blissfully lost in epic tales and tiny, glowing horses. Your gaze lingers on the page's edges, worn and darkened, as if each reader left a fingerprint of time. The thought calms you, the idea that fragility is not weakness, but proof of endurance. You cradle the book gently, as though you might keep it safe a little longer, even if the moths and centuries inevitably win. The paper whispers under your hand, a fragile universe indeed, reminding you that beauty doesn't need to last forever to matter. The scene shifts, and suddenly you're standing at a crossroads of cultures. Persian miniature painting was never sealed away in a gilded bubble. It absorbed, borrowed, and reshaped ideas like a sponge that just happened to be dipped in gold dust. You watch as caravans roll in from the east and the west, carrying not just silk and spices but styles, techniques, and new stories. Here's your grounding fact. During the Mongol Ilkhanid period, 13th to 14th centuries, Persian painters absorbed influences from Chinese art, cloud motifs, landscape compositions, even the way trees bent in the wind. Later, under the Timurids and Safavids, Persian miniature artists both gave and received inspiration from neighboring Ottoman and Mughal courts. Art was a global dialogue long before hashtags made collaboration trendy. Historians still argue whether Persian art dominated this exchange or was itself transformed by it. Was the Persian miniature the influencer of its day, or was it constantly reinvented by foreign fashions? Depending on whom you ask, you'll hear that Persia was the generous host or the endlessly curious guest. Both views carry truth, and the paintings themselves, filled with hybrid motifs, don't bother to explain. Quirky tidbit time. One folio in a Persian manuscript shows a Chinese-style dragon that looks suspiciously like it's smiling, almost cartoonish. Was this a misunderstanding of Chinese iconography or an intentional bit of whimsy? Either way, it suggests that even the most serious courts had moments where art slipped into playful parody. You wander through a painted landscape. Chinese-inspired clouds curl like waves, but beneath them stands a palace with Persian arches, guarded by Ottoman-styled turbans. Horses gallop in miniature Mughal fashion, while the faces wear distinctly Iranian features. It's a mashup centuries before mashups were cool. And you grin, because it reminds you of remix culture today. No one complains when a DJ samples 3 different genres into one track, so why should anyone be surprised that Persian painters borrowed motifs from across continents? They were remixing before Spotify existed. Of course, exchanges weren't always equal. Some rulers demanded manuscripts modeled after rival empires' styles, pushing artists into imitation. Others resisted, holding on to pure Persian aesthetics. The tension was real: adapt or preserve, blend or protect. You can almost hear the debates in the studios, one apprentice sketching a Chinese pine tree, another insisting it should be replaced by a Persian cypress. Yet out of this tug-of-war came some of the most dazzling miniatures ever made, works that felt simultaneously local and universal, familiar and foreign. You realize that's part of their magic. They belong everywhere and nowhere, shimmering across cultural borders like the caravans that inspired them. Standing at that crossroads, you feel the hum of exchange, the thrill of contact. The miniature, once small and private, now stretches across continents, reminding you that art doesn't stay still, it travels, evolves, and carries whispers of distant skies. The mood shifts again, quieter now, almost hushed, as though the lamps in the workshop have been dimmed. The golden age of Persian miniature painting begins to fade, and you follow its retreat into smaller, more private spaces. Where once these jewel-like images lit up grand manuscripts commissioned by kings, now they're tucked away in albums, hidden in cabinets, and shared only with those deemed worthy. Here's your grounding fact. By the 16th and 17th centuries, with the spread of printing presses in Europe and shifts in patronage, lavish manuscript production in Persia declined. Miniature painting didn't vanish, but it changed form, moving away from massive epics and royal chronicles into muraka, or personal albums of collected works. These albums preserved fragments, single folios, portraits, even calligraphy panels, pasted together like scrapbooks for elite collectors. Historians still argue whether this shift represented decline or evolution. Was the miniature art quietly dying, stripped of its former glory, or was it simply reinventing itself in a more intimate form? Some scholars see a tragic ending, others a graceful retreat. Like most debates, the truth probably lies somewhere between. Art rarely dies, it just changes shape. Your quirky tidbit: certain albums became so prized that they were guarded like treasure chests, and owners sometimes wrote little ownership notes in the margins. This belongs to so-and-so, don't even think about stealing it. A very polite version of sticking your name on your lunchbox. You picture an artist in this new era, no longer surrounded by the bustling court, no longer illustrating an entire Shahnameth for a king. Instead, he paints a single portrait, just one carefully detailed face, a flower tucked into a turban, maybe a soft smile. His audience is smaller, but perhaps more devoted. You can almost feel the atmosphere, the hush of a private chamber, a patron flipping through an album by lamplight, lingering over each folio like a secret indulgence. These miniatures are no longer loud announcements of royal power, they're whispers, murmurs, confidences. It's funny, you think of how today people curate Instagram feeds, choosing their best moments to display in little squares. The Muraka albums weren't so different, carefully arranged collections of beautiful fragments, designed to impress, delight, and define taste. Persian art had simply gone from the stage to the pocket-sized gallery. Still, there's a melancholy here. You can sense the weight of something slipping away, the grandeur dimming. Yet within that retreat lies another kind of beauty, the intimacy of art shared between fewer eyes, protected from the noisy world. You close one of these imagined albums gently, aware that inside it, entire universes have been compressed into pages that once slipped quietly through history's shadows. You step forward in time, and suddenly the folios are no longer guarded in palace cabinets but displayed under bright museum lights. The miniature, once secret and intimate, now finds itself face to face with modern audiences who squint through glass cases and snap photos with glowing phones. The art has survived centuries, and now it must survive interpretation. Here's your grounding fact. Persian miniatures began entering European collections in the 18th and 19th centuries, often through colonial networks and private dealers. By the 20th century, major museums, from London to New York to Tehran, were mounting exhibitions, presenting these works as treasures of world heritage. Some institutions displayed them as isolated masterpieces, others as artifacts within the sweep of Islamic art. Historians still argue whether this new context preserves or distorts the miniature's meaning. Was a folio meant to be torn from its manuscript and framed on a wall? Or does removing it from its book, its poetry, and its tactile intimacy strip it of its soul? The debate hums in curatorial circles, with no easy answer. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some modern exhibitions, curators have used magnifying glasses on stands, letting visitors lean in and examine every tiny brushstroke. Of course, this sometimes backfires when someone inevitably bonks their forehead on the glass. Even in reverence, there's comedy. As you stroll through one of these galleries, you notice the contrast. Centuries-old art surrounded by neon exit signs, security cameras, and the occasional bored schoolchild tugging on a parent's sleeve. Yet the miniatures hold their ground. Their colors, still luminous, whisper across time. You sense their defiance, tiny, fragile, yet unshaken. The revival isn't just in museums. Contemporary Iranian artists have reimagined the miniature style, blending it with modern themes, city skylines instead of gardens, skyscrapers instead of palaces, even political commentary tucked into delicate flourishes. The brush remains, but the stories have shifted. Some praise this as living tradition, others criticize it as appropriation or dilution. Either way, it proves the miniature is not frozen, it's alive, still morphing. You smile, because it feels oddly familiar. Just as miniatures once absorbed Chinese clouds or Ottoman turbans, now they absorb neon lights and global anxieties. The canvas may be small, but its appetite for reinvention is endless. Walking through this modern gallery, you feel both the weight of history and the spark of renewal. The miniature has traveled far, palace to album, album to museum, museum to the digital feed you'll probably scroll before sleep. Yet at every stop, it has remained what it always was, a portal into worlds at once tiny and infinite. At last, you settle into stillness, the long journey through gardens, palaces, myths, and museums behind you. The miniature painting rests before you, not as a relic or an artifact, but as an invitation. It whispers, slow down. Look closer. Let detail be enough. Here's your grounding fact. Even today, miniature painting survives as a practiced craft in Iran, India, and beyond. Art schools teach the old methods, gemstone pigments, fine brushes, burnished paper, sometimes in combination with modern tools. Students spend hours on a single square inch, learning the same patience their ancestors carried like a quiet prayer. Historians still argue whether this modern practice should be called continuity or revival. Is it the same tradition, unbroken across centuries, or is it something new wearing old clothes? The discussion may never be resolved, but perhaps the labels matter less than the simple fact that the art still lives. Your quirky tidbit: some contemporary workshops sell miniature starter kits with ready-made brushes and gold flecks, a bit like paint by numbers meets luxury stationery. Imagine ordering a centuries-old art form in a gift box, complete with instructions that probably boil down to now spend 10 years mastering patience. You chuckle at the thought, but also feel the allure. After all, isn't there something deeply human about wanting to hold stillness in your hand? To paint one leaf, then another, then 100 more until repetition becomes meditation? You imagine yourself with brush in hand, dipping into ultramarine, breathing slowly, tracing the curve of a petal. For a moment, your restless thoughts ease, tethered to the detail in front of you. No deadline, no phone buzzing, just color, patience, and the soft hum of your own breath. The miniature offers you not escape, but return, a return to slowness, to noticing, to care. In its tiny borders lies a vast calm, waiting for anyone willing to linger. And so, tonight, you close this journey knowing you don't need to be a king, a scholar, or a master painter to feel its gift. You only need to pause, look, and let the calm brush against you like a whisper. Now the pace softens, the words stretching longer, quieter, as though each syllable carries you gently toward rest. You let your body sink a little deeper, shoulders loosening, breath slowing. The folios and pigments fade, and in their place remains only a sense of stillness. The miniature's gift was never just its colors or its gilding. It was always the invitation to stop, to notice the detail, the patience, the beauty compressed into something so small it could be held between fingertips. That same invitation lingers now, wrapping around you like a light blanket. You remember the gardens, the myths, the calligraphy flowing like water. You remember the fragile paper, the whispering stars of geometry, the lovers in the margins. Each moment still shimmers faintly, but no longer clamors for your attention. They recede softly, like lights in the distance. Your breath lengthens. Your thoughts quiet. The patterns you traced through centuries dissolve into the rhythm of your heartbeat. Perhaps that is the final secret of the miniature, that in its stillness, you find your own. So you let yourself drift, slowly, like gold dust settling on vellum. There's no hurry, no task to complete, only the gentle fading of sound and image. You are safe, you are calm, and the night is yours. Sweet dreams.